So the first style of learning that we're going to talk about in this unit in depth is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a stimulus-stimulus type of learning. And what this means is that we're learning to associate one stimulus with another. Okay? We are not associating a stimulus and the response. We are associating a stimulus with another. For example, we know that when it thunders, it also lightnings, and it's actually the reverse, right? So the lightning happens, and we know that thunder is going to happen after that. Therefore, we wince because that thunder scares us, right? We jump back. We associate lightning and thunder together. Those are two stimulus. They're stimuli. We do not associate lightning and then the response of wincing. So like just because you're going to wince doesn't mean that there has to be lightning, right? We know that we are associating thunder and lightning, not lightning and the wincing of thunder. Okay, so the person who you need to know for classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. And Pavlov, what he says is that when a neutral stimulus, okay, a stimulus that is neutral, is associated with a stimulus that naturally brings about a response, eventually that neutral stimulus will bring about the same response. Okay, this will make sense once we get into it a little bit thicker, okay? But first, we need to figure out what he did. So Pavlov was actually not a psychologist, which is kind of funny. He gives us one of the major ideas in psychology, and he's not a psychologist. He was a physiologist. He was trying to understand dogs' digestive processes, okay? And he was looking at when they salivate and how much they salivate with food. He just happened to stumble upon classical conditioning when his experiment for digestive processes was going awry. And so he wanted to figure out why. And so that's when he started eliciting this different experiment to figure out why dogs were salivating before food was even presented. So we need to understand a few vocab words before we can move on and actually talk about the experiment. The first is stimulus. Stimulus is a thing. It's something that you respond to. It can be an object. It can be a sensation. It can be a person, whatever it might be. A stimulus is something that we respond to. A response is the action or the behavior that happens because of the stimulus, so because of the thing. Okay? We also want to talk about the difference between the two words, unconditioned and conditioned. Unconditioned is naturally existing. Our body does it innately. It is unlearned. We do not have to learn these things, okay? No one has to teach us to flinch in pain when the dentist hurts you, right? You just do it. Conditioned, on the other hand, means something that we have learned or been taught. For example, you need to learn the value of money before you work hours and hours to make money at your new job, right? We've learned the value of money in order to work. Okay. So, these words are going to be like so much because they're a lot of the same words, but I want you to just remember, unconditioned stimulus, remember those innate stimulus, leads to an innate response. Okay, so the example is food, right? When we see food, we automatically salivate because our body is preparing to digest the food. Unconditioned stimulus is food. Unconditioned response is salivation. Conditioned stimulus leads to a conditioned response. So a learned stimulus leads to a learned response. We're going to get into this in a little bit. But our conditioned stimulus is actually a neutral stimulus at first. It elicits no response at first. Okay? For example, a bell is not going to make you salivate. But eventually, if we pair it with an unconditioned stimulus, we associate the two together, we're going to get a conditioned response. Okay? So, our unconditioned response and our conditioned response are almost always the same or very similar. So, for example, wincing in pain to the doctor hurting your mouth, or the dentist hurting your mouth, is going to lead to anxiety of that pain. Okay? Puking after you eat at McDonald's is going to lead to you getting nauseous just thinking about McDonald's. Make sense? That's the idea. Okay, let's look at Pavlov's dog. So what happened is he would ring a bell. Pavlov would ring a bell. It was actually a tuning fork, but let's not get technical. So Pavlov would ring a bell, and then he would present food just a half a second later. The dog would salivate every single time. Why? Well, because we have this neutral stimulus. This bell is not making the dog salivate, right? The food was. The dogs were preparing to eat the food. This is our unconditioned stimulus. This is our unconditioned response. An innate, something that we don't have to learn, innate response. It's just coming, it just so happens to be paired with this bell, okay? During this phase, this is called acquisition. This is when our neutral stimulus is paired with our unconditioned stimulus, okay? And it happens over and over and over again, and eventually our neutral stimulus becomes our conditioned stimulus, right? So acquisition is the idea that we have now repeatedly presented our neutral stimulus and our conditioned stimulus, or an unconditioned stimulus, and now we have our conditioned response. This only happens, though, if the neutral stimulus, the bell, comes before the unconditioned stimulus, the food. And it has to be a short amount of time. It can't be a long time. It has to be short, okay? So, in this case, the neutral stimulus was the bell. It has now become conditioned, right? We've now learned to associate the bell and the food, or the dogs have. And so, in order to determine if this was a success, we'll ring the bell without the food and see if the dog salivates. If they do, fantastic, conditioning worked. That becomes our conditioned response. So let's look at this completely, okay? So the unconditioned stimulus, food, leads to the unconditioned innate response, salivation. If we would just ring a bell, there would be no salivation. That's a neutral stimulus. However, when we pair that bell, add the food, then we get salivation because the dogs are salivating to the food. Eventually, if we repeat this step over and over and over again, this bell has now been associated with the food. And so you can just ring the bell and the dog will salivate. Okay? Let's look at another human example. So every time someone flushes a toilet in your house, the shower becomes very hot and causes the person in the shower to jump back. Okay, so what is our unconditioned stimulus? What is the thing that happens? Hot water. Hot water happens from the shower. Hot water is going to cause you to jump back. You don't want to be under it, right? Okay. The neutral stimuli is the toilet flushing. Toilet flushing does not cause you to jump back. Okay, so toilet flushing, there's no response. When we pair the toilet flushing and hot water, we jump back. We've learned toilet flushing plus hot water, jump back. Eventually, after this is repeated over and over again, someone flushing the toilet is going to lead you to jump back because you're afraid that the water will be hot. Okay, so that's how it happens. Some other examples, advertisements, pairing an attractive person with the product, bell ringing to end class, you know that ends class, and then anxiety when you hear the sound of your dentist's drill because you're afraid of the pain. Okay, extinction. Let's talk about extinction. Extinction is when the unconditioned stimulus, okay, so the food does not come after the bell. So if over and over the bell is rung and you salivate, the bell is rung and you salivate, but then no food is presented, eventually your salivation is going to start to decrease. It's going to go extinct like the dinosaurs. So this happens over time, okay? However, we do have spontaneous recovery, and this is after a rest period, an extinguished or extinct conditioned response, that salivation, comes back if the tone persists, okay? So the idea is that if we put that after a rest period, the conditioned response, the salivation, okay, is going to come back just randomly if the tone continues. But if it just continues alone and there's no food, it's going to become extinct again, okay? Okay, we also have the idea of stimulus generalization. This is the idea that we tend to respond to stimuli that is similar to the conditioned response. Example, if the dogs are going to salivate to a horn as well as the bell, which they were first conditioned to. Pavlov tested this by conditioning dogs to salivate to small vibrations in their thigh. The dog still salivated to the vibrations on other parts of their body near the thigh. However, salivation did drop the farther away the thigh got from the vibrations. Okay, stimulus discrimination is the ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimuli and stimuli that do not signal unconditioned response. Pavlov did this by ringing different tones on the tuning fork to teach discrimination. So if you get by a German Shepherd, you're not necessarily scared of all dogs, just German Shepherds. Okay, and that is classical conditioning.